The rain fell like it was trying to erase her. 12 years old, no coat, no name anyone bothered to ask for, Zuri pressed herself into a doorway on a Seoul side street and waited for the cold to stop mattering. She didn't see the black car slow down. She didn't see the man step out into the storm like weather was beneath his notice. She only felt a coat settle over her shoulders, heavy and warm and smelling like cedar, and a voice, low and certain, say 4 words that would rewrite the rest of her life. "You're safe now. Stay close." 20 years later, she would walk into a courtroom in a tailored suit, holding the one piece of evidence that could save his empire, and remember that voice like it was yesterday. If you've ever wondered what happens when a debt of love outlives an empire built on fear, stay with this one to the end, because this is the story that will make you believe loyalty is its own kind of forever. Seoul, 20 years earlier. The rain had been falling for 6 days straight, the kind of relentless autumn rain that turned the city into a smear of neon and puddles, and Kang Min-ho hated every second of it. He was 26 years old and already the second most feared name in the Gangnam underworld, a man who had inherited a criminal empire from a father who died young and left him nothing but enemies and a ledger of debts written in blood. He did not stop for beggars. He did not stop for anyone. But that night, driving back from a meeting that had nearly ended in gunfire, something made him tell his driver to slow down outside an alley behind a shuttered noodle shop. She was small, folded into herself the way children fold when they've learned that taking up space invites danger. Her clothes were soaked through. Her lips had gone the color of the sky. Min-ho did not know later why he got out of the car. He was not a sentimental man. His men would tell you if you asked them privately and they trusted you enough to answer honestly, that Kang Min-ho did not have a soft place left in him after his father's death. But he crouched down in that alley in a $3,000 suit that would never be the same, and he asked the girl her name. She didn't answer. She just stared at him with eyes that had already seen too much of the world's cruelty to trust a stranger's kindness. He took off his coat anyway and wrapped it around her, and when she still wouldn't move, he said the words that would live in her memory for the next 2 decades. "You're safe now. Stay close." It wasn't affection. He told himself that for years. It was reflex obligation, some broken piece of the boy he used to be before the world taught him not to feel things. But he took her back to the compound that night, and he did not send her away in the morning, and somewhere in the weeks that followed, without either of them noticing exactly when it happened, the empty room down the hall from his study became hers. Her name, she finally told him after 9 days of silence, was Zuri. She did not remember much before the streets, a mother who left, a father who never existed in any way that mattered. She had learned to survive by making herself small and quiet, by reading rooms before anyone in them could hurt her, and Min-ho recognized that particular kind of survival because he had built his entire empire out of the same instinct. He did not adopt her, not legally, not with paperwork that could be traced or used against either of them. But he made it known, in the quiet and absolute way that men like him made things known, that she belonged to his house and anyone who touched her would answer to him personally. The years that followed were not soft. Min-ho's world was blood and leverage and midnight phone calls that ended careers and sometimes lives, but within the walls of the compound he built something that almost resembled a childhood for her. Tutors came. A woman named Mrs. Han taught her to read in 3 languages. He was not present for most of it, buried as he was in the business of keeping his empire from being swallowed by rivals who smelled weakness and a young boss who had inherited too much too soon. But every evening without fail, no matter what fires he had spent the day extinguishing, he came to find her before she slept, and he asked her one question: "Did anyone make you feel unsafe today?" If the answer was ever yes, someone in his organization had a very bad morning after. She grew up watching him from doorways the way she used to watch danger on the streets, except now what she was watching for was different. She watched the way his shoulders carried the weight of 100 men's loyalty and 1,000 men's fear. She watched the way his face changed, almost imperceptibly, when he thought no one was looking, into something tired and young and lonely. By the time she was 17, she understood something she did not yet have language for. She was not just grateful to him. She loved him in the complicated, dangerous, entirely inconvenient way a girl loves the only person who ever chose her. Min-ho noticed the shift before she said a word about it, because noticing things was the entire architecture of how he had survived this long. He noticed the way her gaze lingered a half-second too long. He noticed the careful distance she started keeping, the sudden shyness that hadn't been there before, and he made a decision that cost him more than any business negotiation he had ever walked away from. He sent her to university in London, not because he wanted her gone. Because he understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had spent his whole life calculating risk, exactly what would happen if she stayed, and exactly how much it would destroy her to be tied to a man whose life was measured in enemies and body counts. The morning she left for the airport, she stood in the doorway of his study, the same doorway she had watched him from 1,000 times, and she asked him if he wanted her to go. He told her yes. It was the only lie he had ever told her, and it was the one that hurt the most to say. She left. She did not come back for 4 years. 20 years is a long time to build an empire, and it is a long time to keep a secret from yourself. In that span, Kang Min-ho transformed Kang Group from a criminal syndicate whispered about in police briefings into something far more dangerous and far more legitimate. A conglomerate with holdings in shipping, construction, and finance that laundered its violent roots so thoroughly most of Seoul's elite had forgotten they ever existed. He was 46 now, silver threading through his hair at the temples, a man who commanded boardrooms the way he once commanded gunmen with the same absolute and unshakable authority. He had never married. He had never in 20 years allowed himself to want anything the way he had once wanted her presence in the house. Zuri had become someone else entirely, or so she told herself. She finished her degree in London, then law school, then built a career as a prosecutor known for taking cases no one else wanted. Cases against powerful men who thought their money made them untouchable. She told herself this was coincidence, that her fascination with dismantling corrupt empires had nothing to do with the man who raised her. She told herself a great many things over the years. None of them were entirely true. She had not spoken to Kang Min-ho in 6 years. Not since the last time she visited Seoul and stood in his office and told him, in a voice shaking with a fury she didn't fully understand herself, that she couldn't keep doing this, couldn't keep loving a ghost of a father figure who had built his fortune on other people's suffering, couldn't reconcile the man who tucked her in at night with the man whose name made grown businessmen go pale. He had not tried to stop her from leaving. He never tried to stop her from anything. That, more than anything else, was the cruelest kindness he had ever shown her. Then the case landed on her desk. The Prosecutor General's office had been building a file on Kang Group for 3 years, a slow, patient excavation into money laundering, extortion, and the suspicious deaths of 2 whistleblowers who had once worked inside the organization. Zuri did not choose the case. It was assigned to her randomly by a system that had no idea it was about to detonate the most carefully buried part of her life. She sat in her office at 11 at night with the file open on her desk and Kang Min-ho's photograph staring up at her, older now, harder around the eyes, and she felt something crack open in her chest that she had spent 6 years welding shut. She could recuse herself. Any ethical prosecutor would have recused herself the moment she saw his name. But underneath the panic, underneath the years of careful distance, something else stirred, something that felt dangerously close to relief. A reason to see him again that wasn't about wanting to, a reason that came with armor built in. She took the case. The first time she saw him again was not in a courtroom. It was in a parking garage beneath the prosecutor's building at 9 in the evening, when she was leaving late and found him leaning against a car that cost more than her apartment, waiting for her like he had never once doubted she would come this way. 20 years had changed him. It had not changed the way her whole body reacted to the sight of him, the way her pulse forgot how to behave itself. "You look well," he said. It was the first thing he'd said to her in 6 years, and it came out quieter than she expected, almost careful, like he was handling glass. "You look guilty," she said, because she needed the armor immediately, because standing 3 feet away from him was already unraveling something she had spent 2 decades trying to keep tied down. Something that might have been the ghost of a smile moved across his face. "I've been called worse by better lawyers. I'm not here to trade jokes with you, Min-ho." His name felt foreign and familiar in her mouth at the same time, like a language she used to speak fluently and had forced herself to forget. "I've been assigned your case." The silence that followed told her he already knew. Of course he knew. Men like Kang Min-ho did not get ambushed by information. They were only ever surprised by things they allowed themselves to be surprised by, and the look on his face now was not surprise. It was something closer to resignation, and beneath that, something she almost didn't want to identify because identifying it would mean admitting she still knew how to read him. "Then you should also know," he said, "that I didn't kill those men." That's exactly what a guilty man says. It's exactly what an innocent man says too. The difference is I'm telling you. He pushed off the car, and even now, even at 46 with a criminal empire crumbling somewhere in the paperwork stacked on her desk, he moved like a man who had never once questioned whether a room belonged to him. He stopped closer than was strictly professional, close enough that she caught the same cedar smell that had once wrapped around her 12-year-old shoulders in a rainstorm. "I know what you think of me, Zuri. I know what you think this life has made me, but I never lied to you, not once, not about anything that mattered. You lied to me about wanting me gone." The words hung in the damp concrete air between them, 20 years of silence finally cracking open in a parking garage that smelled like exhaust and rain. Min-ho's jaw tightened, and for one unguarded second she saw it, the thing he had spent 2 decades burying under boardrooms and blood debts in careful distance. Regret. Not for the empire, Not for the men he'd hurt to build it, for her. Yes, he said finally, I lied about that. She should have walked away. Every professional instinct, every carefully constructed wall she'd built brick by brick since she was 17, told her to walk away right then, get in her car, drive home, and request a recusal in the morning before this went any further than it already had. Instead, she stood there in the rain-damp garage, staring at the only man who had ever chosen her, and felt 20 years of distance collapsing in on itself like it had never been real at all. I have to prosecute this case, she said, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. Whatever this is between us, I can't let it change that. I'm not asking you to, he said it evenly, but something underneath the words trembled just slightly, just enough for her to hear it. I'm asking you to find the truth. That's all I've ever asked of you, Zuri. Even when you were 17 and looking at me like I hung the stars, I never asked you to see me as anything other than what I was. And what was that? A man trying to give you a life better than the one I found you in. He stepped back then, putting the distance between them that professionalism demanded, that 20 years demanded, that every ounce of self-preservation in both of them demanded. The case file will show you everything. I have nothing to hide from you. I never did. He walked away into the rain without looking back, and Zuri stood alone in the garage for a long time afterward, her heart doing something violent and unfamiliar in her chest, understanding with sudden, terrifying clarity that this case was not going to be the closure she'd told herself she wanted. It was going to be the opposite of closure. It was going to be the thing that finally forced her to reckon with 20 years of a love she had never once stopped feeling, dressed up as duty, filed under an oath she'd sworn to a system that had no idea it was about to collide with the one debt neither of them had ever managed to settle. The debt of a girl who owed a dangerous man her entire life, and a man who owed that girl a truth 20 years overdue. That's the opening act, roughly 2,000 words, establishing the hook, backstory, the 20-year time jump, and the reunion that kicks off the central conflict. I can continue with the next installment, the investigation deepening, jealousy danger elements, arrival threatening both of them, and the slow burn toward the fade to black moment. Whenever you're ready, just say the word and I'll pick up right where this left off. The next morning, Zuri arrived at her office to find the case file had grown overnight. 3 new folders added by an investigator named Detective O who had been quietly building the Kang Group case for longer than anyone in the office wanted to admit. She sat at her desk with coffee going cold beside her, and made herself read every page with the same clinical distance she brought to every case, and she almost believed she was succeeding until she reached the financial records and saw, buried in a footnote, a wire transfer from 21 years ago that funded a scholarship trust under a name she didn't recognize. She recognized the account number. It was the one that had paid for her tuition in London. She sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment, understanding all over again that Kang Min-ho had never once, in 20 years, stopped being careful with her, even when he was busy building an empire that would eventually be dragged into a courtroom by the very girl he'd protected. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number, though she knew immediately whose it was. Lunch. Neutral ground, you need to hear the rest before you build your case on half of it. She should have said no. She typed several versions of no before finally sending back one word, where. The restaurant he chose was small, unremarkable, tucked into a side street in Jongno that had nothing to do with the glass towers of Kang Group's legitimate holdings. He was already seated when she arrived, and she noticed against her will that he'd chosen a table in the back corner away from windows, the same instinct that had kept him alive for 2 decades now apparently extended to protecting her from being photographed with him. It should not have moved her. It did anyway. You found the trust, he said before she'd even sat down. It wasn't a question. You funded my entire education through a shell account tied to money that's now the subject of a federal money laundering investigation. She kept her voice low, controlled, the voice she used in depositions when she needed a witness to understand she already knew the answer to the question she was asking. Do you understand what that looks like, Min-ho? It looks like you laundered dirty money through your own ward's tuition payments. It looks like whatever the prosecution wants it to look like. He said it without heat, which somehow made it worse. But it's the truth that matters to you, isn't it? Not what it looks like. The truth is a luxury I don't always get to argue for. Then let me give you the truth anyway, and you can decide what to do with it. He folded his hands on the table, and for a moment he looked less like the man who ran Kang Group and more like the man who used to sit at the edge of her bed asking if anyone had made her feel unsafe. That account was clean. I made sure of that specifically because I knew someday someone would look. I didn't launder money through you, Zuri. I protected you from every dirty account I had by making sure the one that touched your life never would be. And the whistleblowers, the 2 men who ended up dead after they started talking to federal investigators. Something shifted in his face, a flicker of genuine grief that surprised her because she hadn't expected him capable of grief for men his organization might have killed. Their names were Jang Ho-seok and Lim Di-young. They worked for me for 11 and 13 years respectively. I did not order their deaths. And I have spent 3 months trying to find out who did because whoever did it wanted exactly what's happening right now. They wanted an investigation. They wanted Kang Group destabilized. They wanted me distracted. He paused. And they wanted you assigned to this case, which tells me they know things about us that should have stayed buried 20 years ago. Zuri felt something cold move through her. You think someone is targeting me specifically? I think someone did their research and realized the fastest way to destroy me was never going to be a gun. It was going to be you. He leaned forward slightly. Which means from this moment forward you are not safe, and I will not apologize for what I'm about to do about that. Min-ho, I don't need. You needed it once before in an alley in the rain, and I've never once regretted showing up. His voice dropped, quieter now, the boardroom authority stripped away until what was left sounded almost young, almost afraid. I let you walk away 6 years ago because you asked me to, and because some part of me thought you deserved a life that didn't have my name attached to the danger in it. I am not going to make that mistake again while someone is actively hunting you to get to me. She wanted to argue. She had built an entire career, an entire adult identity, on not needing anyone's protection, least of all his. But something in the set of his jaw told her this was not a negotiation, and something quieter and more dangerous inside her chest did not entirely want it to be. 3 days later, the man who'd been surveilling the case investigators was found briefly, before he disappeared again into the underground network that had apparently been watching Zuri's apartment for 2 weeks without her noticing. Detective O delivered the news personally, his face grim, a photograph of a black sedan parked outside her building at 3 separate times over the past 10 days. Whoever this is, he said, they're patient, and patient is worse than reckless in my experience. Zuri sat with that information for exactly 1 evening before her doorbell rang, and she opened it to find Kang Min-ho standing in her hallway with 2 of his men positioned discreetly at either end of the corridor, a duffel bag in his hand that she recognized, absurdly, as containing her favorite tea, the same brand Mrs. Han used to make her as a child. I'm not moving in with you, she said immediately. I didn't ask you to, he held up the bag. I asked my driver to buy this because I remembered you liked it, and then I realized I couldn't hand it to you without also telling you that there are 2 men outside your building tonight, and there will be 2 men outside your building every night until this is resolved, whether you invite me in or not. She let him in. She told herself it was about the case, about information sharing, about 2 people with a shared enemy pooling resources for mutual protection. She told herself that for the better part of 2 hours while they sat at her small kitchen table, and went through everything he knew about who might want Kang Group destabilized badly enough to frame him for murder, and put his adopted daughter's career at risk to do it. She told herself that story right up until midnight when he stood to leave, and she found herself standing too close to the door, close enough to smell the cedar again, close enough that neither of them moved for 1 long, suspended second. You should go, she said, and her voice didn't sound like her own. I should, he agreed and didn't. The catalyst, when it came, arrived 4 days later in the form of an actual bomb threat called into the courthouse the morning Zuri was scheduled to present preliminary findings to a judge. The building was evacuated. Detective O's team found nothing, which was somehow more terrifying than finding something because it meant whoever had made the call wanted them rattled, not dead, at least not yet. Zuri stood on the sidewalk outside the courthouse in the gray morning light, adrenaline making her hands shake, and looked up to find Kang Min-ho already there, having arrived faster than should have been possible, his face a mask of controlled fury that she recognized from 20 years ago, the exact expression he used to wear right before someone in his organization had a very bad day. I'm fine, she said before he could ask. You are not fine, you are shaking. He didn't touch her, not at first, his hands staying carefully at his sides even as everything in his posture strained toward her. Zuri. Don't. Her voice cracked just slightly, 20 years of careful distance finally giving way under the weight of adrenaline and fear and the particular exhaustion of pretending she didn't still love him. Don't look at me like that. I can't do this if you look at me like that. Like what? Like I still matter to you the way I used to. Something broke open in his face then, some final wall he'd been holding since the parking garage, since London, since the morning she left for the airport 20 years ago, and he told the only lie he'd ever told her. You have never once stopped mattering to me the way you used to, he said low and rough, and this time he did reach for her, his hand finding her arm, gentle, careful, the same careful he'd been since the night he wrapped a coat around a soaked and silent 12-year-old in an alley. I sent you away because I loved you too much to keep you in a life built on the kind of danger that just tried to blow up a courthouse to scare you. I have spent 20 years telling myself that was the right decision. I am no longer certain of anything except that I am done pretending distance ever protected either of us from this. The kiss, when it happened, was not planned by either of them. It happened on a sidewalk outside an evacuated courthouse with sirens still echoing somewhere in the distance, his hand cradling her jaw like something breakable, her fingers curling into the front of his coat like she was 12 years old again and finally warm. It lasted only a few seconds. It undid 20 years of careful distance in all of them. She pulled back first, breathless, eyes wide with something that looked almost like panic. "This can't happen," she whispered. "I'm prosecuting your case, Min-ho, if anyone finds out." "Then we'll be careful?" His voice was steady even though his hand was still trembling slightly where it cupped her face. "The way I was careful with that trust account 20 years ago. I am very good at being careful, Zuri. I am less good at pretending I don't love you, and I find I no longer have any interest in trying." She should have stepped back. She should have recused herself that morning, called her supervisor, ended this before it went any further than a moment of adrenaline and fear on a sidewalk. Instead, she stood there in the gray morning light and let herself, for one suspended moment, believe that maybe this was not the destruction of everything she'd built, but the beginning of the one thing she'd spent 20 years running from admitting she wanted. That evening, alone in her apartment with the case file spread across her kitchen table and his men stationed quietly outside, she found the thread that would change everything. A name buried in a subsidiary company 3 levels removed from Kang Group's legitimate holdings. A name that connected the whistleblower's deaths, the surveillance on her building, and the bomb threat at the courthouse to a man she recognized instantly. Because she had prosecuted his brother 8 years earlier and watched him swear revenge from the gallery of her own courtroom. The Empire was not the only thing under threat. Someone had been planning this for years, patient enough to wait for the exact moment Zuri would be assigned the case, patient enough to understand that the fastest way to burn Kang Min-ho's world to the ground was never going to be a bullet. It was going to be the one person he had never learned how to stop loving. 2 days after Zuri found the name buried in the subsidiary filings, she sat across from Detective O in an interview room that smelled like burnt coffee and told him everything. The name was Choi Di-sung, younger brother of Choi Yi-sung, a construction magnate she had prosecuted 8 years earlier for bribing city inspectors to approve buildings with structural violations that eventually killed 11 people when a parking garage collapsed. Yi-sung was still in prison. Di-sung had spent those 8 years rebuilding what remained of the family's legitimate businesses while quietly buying his way into 3 shell companies that fed directly into Kang Group's shipping subsidiary. "He's not just angry at Min-ho," Zuri said, spreading the financial documents across the table. "He's angry at me. I put his brother away. He's been waiting for a way to hurt both of us at once." And framing Kang Group for the whistleblower murders does exactly that. It destroys Min-ho's empire and it destroys my career, because the second it comes out that I have a 20-year history with the man I'm prosecuting, I lose everything I've built. Detective O studied the documents for a long moment. "You need to tell your supervisor about your relationship with Kang Min-ho before Choi does it for you." "I know. Today, Zuri." "I know." She rubbed her hands over her face, exhaustion pulling at every part of her. "I just need to understand what we're dealing with first. If I recuse myself now, the case goes to someone who doesn't know Choi is behind this, and Choi gets exactly what he wants. Min-ho goes down for murders he didn't commit, and nobody ever looks past him to find the actual architect." She left the interview room with a headache building behind her eyes and her phone already ringing. Min-ho's name on the screen sent a small, traitorous warmth through her chest even now, even with everything at stake. She answered on the second ring. "I need you to come to the compound," he said without preamble, and something in his voice, tight and controlled in a way she recognized from 20 years of reading his moods, told her this wasn't a request born of longing. "Now, Zuri, it's not safe for you to be anywhere else." "What happened?" "Choi Di-sung just sent me a message." A pause, heavy with something he clearly did not want to say. "He has photographs of us, the parking garage, the sidewalk outside the courthouse. He's threatening to release them to every major outlet in Seoul unless I withdraw my legal team from the case and let the prosecution proceed unopposed, which would guarantee my conviction whether I did anything or not." Zuri's stomach dropped. "That's not just going to destroy your case, it's going to destroy my career the moment those photos go public." "I know." His voice cracked slightly on the words, the first real fracture she'd heard in his control since the sidewalk kiss. I know, and I am not going to let that happen to you. Come to the compound, please. She went. She told herself it was strategy, that two targets were safer consolidated than scattered, that this was the same clinical calculation she'd make for any case. She knew, the entire drive across the city with Min-ho's men flanking her car in unmarked vehicles, that it was not really about strategy at all. The compound had changed since she was a girl, expanded and modernized, but the study where he used to ask her every evening if anyone had made her feel unsafe was exactly the same, down to the leather chair by the window. He was standing at that window when she arrived, and he turned when she entered, and the look on his face, raw and afraid in a way she had never once seen on Kang Min-ho in 20 years of knowing him, nearly undid her on the spot. I have people looking for Choi right now, he said, but he's careful. He spent 8 years planning this, which means he has contingencies for every move I make. If I go after him publicly, he releases the photographs regardless. If I don't, he tightens the noose on the case until you're forced to either recuse yourself in disgrace or convict me on evidence he manufactured. There's a third option? Zuri set her bag down and made herself think like a prosecutor instead of a frightened woman standing too close to the man she loved. We get ahead of it. I go to my supervisor today, disclose the relationship myself before Choi can weaponize it and formally recuse. It costs me the case, but it takes away his leverage over my career. And you let your legal team pursue the money laundering angle publicly, force an independent audit of the subsidiary accounts, which will expose Choi's shell companies whether he wants them exposed or not. He'll retaliate. He'll retaliate either way. At least this way we're not handing him the exact outcome he's engineered for us. She looked up at him, steadier now that she had a plan, a structure, something to hold on to besides fear. I am not going to let him turn 20 years of my life into a scandal that ends my career, Min-ho. And I am not going to let him frame you for murders you didn't commit. We fight this the way you taught me to survive in the first place, carefully, together. Something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost like pride beneath the fear. You sound like me. I learned from the best. The words came out softer than she intended, and for a moment the study filled with something that wasn't fear at all, something that felt dangerously like the life they might have had if the world had let them have it plainly, without alleys and empires and 20 years of careful distance between them. The moment didn't last. Min-ho's phone buzzed on the desk and his face changed the instant he read the message, all the warmth draining out of it and leaving something harder and more dangerous in its place. Choi's moved up his timeline, he said. He wants an answer by midnight tonight or the photographs go to 3 networks simultaneously. He looked at her and the fear was back, sharper now, and he's added a second demand. He wants to meet you, alone. Absolutely not, Min-ho said before she could even respond, his voice dropping into something low and lethal that she recognized from childhood, the voice he used right before someone made a very serious mistake in his presence. I wasn't going to say yes, Zuri said carefully, though even as she said it, some cold, calculating part of her mind was already turning the offer over, looking for the angle Choi hadn't accounted for, the same instinct that had made her a prosecutor who took cases no one else wanted. But I want to know why he's asking. Choi doesn't do anything without a reason that benefits him directly. The reason is that he wants to hurt me by hurting you, and I'm not giving him the opportunity. Min-ho crossed the room, and this time when he reached for her there was nothing careful about it, his hands framing her face with a kind of desperate tenderness that made her breath catch. 20 years ago I found you in an alley and I promised myself I would never let anyone make you feel unsafe again. I am not breaking that promise tonight, Zuri. Not for Choi D-sung. Not for anyone. Min-ho. Let me protect you. His forehead dropped to rest against hers, and for a moment the empire and the case and the photographs and the midnight deadline all fell away, and there was only the two of them, 20 years of longing finally admitted out loud in a study that had once been the only safe place either of them had ever known. I let you go once because I thought it was the right thing to do. I am not going to survive letting you walk into danger because I was too proud to admit how afraid I am of losing you. She closed her eyes and for one long, suspended breath she let herself simply feel it, all of it, the fear and the love and the 20 years of distance finally collapsing into something that felt, for the first time, like it might actually hold. Then we do this together, she whispered, whatever happens next together. Outside, the city moved on without any idea that somewhere in a quiet study in Gangnam, the empire, the case, and 20 years of buried love were all converging toward a midnight deadline that would decide everything. Midnight arrived with a cold rain, fitting given how this had all started 20 years earlier. But Min-ho did not wait passively for Choi's deadline. By 10 o'clock, his legal team had already filed for an emergency independent audit of the shipping subsidiary, a public documented move that could not be quietly buried. By 11, Detective O had matched the shell company's signatures to an account Choi Di-sung had used exactly once 7 years ago to pay a contractor who later testified against his brother, a slip so old and so small that Choi had clearly forgotten it existed. "It's enough to bring him in for questioning," O said, pulling up outside the compound gates with 2 unmarked cars behind him. "Not enough to hold him, but enough to rattle him before midnight." "Rattled men make mistakes," Min-ho said. He was already reaching for his coat. "You're not going," Zuri said. "I am absolutely going. Min-ho, if you show up at Choi's building tonight, he'll say you're intimidating a witness and he'll be right. You'll hand him exactly the narrative he needs." She caught his arm, and for once he actually stopped, searching her face like he was looking for something he couldn't afford to miss. "Let O bring him in. Let this happen through the system the way it's supposed to. If you go in there tonight and something happens to Choi, all of this, 20 years of your life, ends in a cell and it will have been for nothing." Something in his jaw tightened, the old instinct warring visibly with the newer. "Harder one." Then he exhaled and the fight went out of him, replaced by something that looked almost like trust. "You've always been better at this than me," he said quietly, "believing in a system that never once protected either of us." "I believe in doing it right," she said, "because doing it wrong is how people like Choi win in the end." Detective O brought Choi Di-sung in for questioning at 11:40, 20 minutes before his own deadline expired, and the timing broke something in him that 8 years of careful planning hadn't accounted for. Confronted with the contractor payment, with the surveillance logs on Zuri's apartment, with a subsidiary audit already filed in public, Choi did what patient, controlled men do when the architecture they've spent years building suddenly buckles beneath them. He talked, first carefully, then desperately, laying blame on associates, on his brother's old contacts, on anyone but himself, and in doing so handed the prosecution everything it needed to untangle the true story of the whistleblower's deaths, a story that led not to Kang Min-ho at all, but to a mid-level Choi employee who had panicked when Jang Ho-seok and Lim De-young started asking questions about the very shell accounts Choi had been using to frame Kang Group. The photographs never made it to a single network. Somewhere in the scramble of his own unraveling, Choi lost the leverage to use them, and by the time his lawyer arrived at the station, the story had already moved past him entirely. Zuri submitted her recusal the next morning anyway. Not because she had to, not any longer, but because she owed the truth to a system she still, despite everything, believed in. She sat across from her supervisor and told her everything: the alley in the rain, the 20 years, the kiss on the sidewalk, and braced herself for the end of the career she'd built brick by careful brick. What she got instead was a long silence, and then a question that surprised her. "Did you falsify anything in that case file?" "No." "Did your relationship with Kang Min-ho influence a single piece of evidence you gathered?" "No, if anything, I was harder on him than I would have been on a stranger." Her supervisor studied her for a long moment. "Then you did your job, Zuri. You disclosed before it became a liability, which is more than most people in your position manage. Take a leave. Let the new prosecutor finish the audit findings, and when you come back, we'll talk about which cases you're ready for next." She walked out of that office lighter than she had felt in 20 years and found Min-ho waiting for her on the courthouse steps, exactly the way he had waited by his car the very first night this had all begun again, except this time there was nothing guarded in his face at all. "It's over," she said, and the words felt strange in her mouth after months of bracing against them. "Choi's facing charges. The case against you collapses without him. I'm on leave, but my career's intact." "And us?" he asked, and for a man who had once run half the underworld of Gangnam, he sounded in that moment entirely unsure of himself, entirely undefended, the way he had never once let anyone see him except her. She closed the distance between them on the courthouse steps, in full daylight, in front of anyone who cared to look, and answered him the only way that felt true after 20 years of almosts. She kissed him, slow and certain, and felt him exhale against her mouth like a man finally setting down a weight he'd carried since a rainy night 2 decades earlier. They married 8 months later in a small garden ceremony at the compound, the same garden where Mrs. Han had once taught a silent, watchful girl to read in 3 languages. Detective O gave a toast that made half the room laugh and the other half cry. Min-ho, a man who had not smiled easily in 20 years of running an empire, could not seem to stop. A year after that, Zuri stood in the doorway of the same study where a 12-year-old girl once watched a dangerous, lonely man from the shadows, and told her husband she was pregnant. He came around the desk slowly, like he was afraid the moment might dissolve if he moved too fast, and knelt in front of her the way he once knelt in an alley in the rain, and pressed his hand gently to her stomach as though checking still, even now, that everything precious in his life was safe. "You're safe now?" he whispered, And this time the words weren't a promise made to a frightened, soaked child by a stranger who didn't yet know what she would become to him. They were a vow, finally kept in full, 20 years in the making, spoken to the family he had once believed a man like him would never be allowed to have. Outside, Seoul went on the way it always did, indifferent to the small, extraordinary thing that had just happened in that quiet study. But inside, in the house built on an empire of fear that love had slowly, stubbornly rebuilt into something else entirely, Kang Min-ho and Zuri finally had exactly what the rain had once tried to take from both of them: each other and a home that no storm would ever touch again.